The rain came down in sheets that night, soaking the small suburban streets in a cold, relentless drizzle. Streetlights flickered, casting an eerie glow on the empty roads, and the hum of a distant police siren broke the otherwise still night. It was the kind of evening that felt heavy, like something important was about to happen. But no one could predict just how important it would be. Officer Derek Lawson sat in his squad car, sipping from a battered thermos. Another long shift, he thought. The city was quiet, too quiet for his liking. His gaze flicked to the dashboard clock. 10:47 p.m. Still hours to go. He drummed his fingers on the steering wheel, scanning the neighborhood for anything out of place. This was the kind of area where people didn't expect trouble. But sometimes trouble showed up where you least expected it. Then he saw her. A young woman walking alone down the sidewalk, clutching a bright pink umbrella that barely held up against the wind. Her dark hoodie was pulled over her head, and she moved quickly, her sneakers splashing through puddles. Something about her seemed off. At least, that's what Derek told himself. Maybe it was the way she kept looking over her shoulder, or how she seemed to be avoiding the pools of light from the street lamps. To Derek, it looked suspicious enough to warrant a closer look. He pulled the squad car alongside her and rolled down the window. "Hey, you there?" he called out, his voice firm, but not overly aggressive. She froze for a moment, then slowly turned her head to look at him. Derek couldn't see much under the shadow of her hoodie, but her posture told him she wasn't happy about the interruption. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked, her voice steady but tinged with annoyance. Derek frowned. There was something about her tone that didn't sit right with him. Most people, especially young women out late at night, are either nervous or overly polite when approached by a cop. This girl, she didn't sound scared. If anything, she sounded like she didn't have time for him. "Just doing my job," Derek replied, stepping out of the car. "Mind telling me what you're doing out here so late?" The girl sighed, a long, exaggerated sigh that made Derek's jaw tighten. "Walking home," she said simply. "From where?" he pressed, crossing his arms. He wasn't sure why, but her calm demeanor irritated him. "Does it matter?" She shot back, finally looking up at him. For a split second, their eyes met, and Derek felt a flicker of something. Was it recognition? No, that was impossible. He didn't know this girl, did he? "Yes, it matters," he said sharply, trying to regain control of the situation. "Do you have ID on you?" She hesitated, her hand hovering over the pocket of her hoodie. For a moment, Derek thought she might run, but instead she pulled out a worn leather wallet and handed over her ID. Derek glanced at it, his eyes scanning the name, the address. Something about it seemed familiar, but he couldn't quite place it. "All right, Miss Jordan," he said, handing the ID back. "Where do you live?" "About 3 blocks that way," she said, pointing down the street. "Can I go now?" Derek hesitated. Something still didn't feel right. He decided to push a little further. "Why were you walking in the middle of the street back there? Didn't look like you were trying to get home." She rolled her eyes, an act of defiance that made Derek's blood boil. "Because the sidewalk's flooded. Look, officer, I don't know what you're looking for, but I'm just trying to get home. Alone, safely. That okay with you?" Her sarcasm was almost too much to take. Derek took a step closer, his hand hovering near his belt. Not his gun, but close enough to make a statement. "Watch your tone," he warned. "I'm just doing my job." "I'm just living my life," she shot back. "Is that a crime now?" Before Derek could respond, his radio crackled to life. "Officer Lawson, we need you at 14th and Pine," the dispatcher said. "Possible break-in. Responding units en route." Derek stared at the girl for a long moment. Part of him wanted to ignore the call and keep pressing her, to figure out why she was so confident, so unbothered. But the job came first. He stepped back, narrowing his eyes. "You can go," he said reluctantly, "but I'll be watching." The girl didn't say anything. She just turned and walked away, her pink umbrella bobbing in the rain. Derek watched her until she disappeared around the corner, a strange feeling gnawing at him. He couldn't explain it, but something about her stuck with him. Later that night, back at the station, Derek found himself unable to shake the encounter. He logged into the system and ran her name. What he found stopped him cold. His heart pounded as he stared at the screen, the pieces clicking into place. Jordan wasn't just anyone. She was someone. And Derek had no idea just how big a mistake he'd made. Derek stared at the screen, the dim glow of the monitor highlighting the furrow in his brow. He scrolled through the records again, convinced his eyes were playing tricks on him. But no matter how many times he read it, the name jumped out at him like a neon sign. *** Jordan, Ellison ***, her father's name, listed right there in bold under emergency contact, was what made his stomach twist into knots. Marcus Ellison. The Marcus Ellison. Derek leaned back in his chair, trying to process what this meant. Everyone in the department knew who Marcus Ellison was. He wasn't just a powerful man. He was untouchable. A respected business mogul, a community leader, a man who had connections in places Derek could only dream of. He had donated millions to local charities, helped fund youth programs, and even had his name etched on the side of the New City Library. But more than that, Marcus Ellison had a reputation for protecting his family fiercely. Stories circulated about how anyone who crossed him or his loved ones often found themselves on the wrong side of fate, professionally, socially, sometimes even legally. Derek's mind raced as he replayed the encounter in his head. The girl's calm defiance, her unflinching gaze, of course she wasn't scared. She knew exactly who had her back. If he'd known who she was in that moment, would he have acted differently? He wanted to believe the answer was no, that he was just doing his job, but deep down, he knew the truth. This wasn't just any random girl walking in the rain. He'd stopped *** Marcus Ellison's daughter ***, and he threatened her. The weight of that realization settled in his chest like a stone. What if she told her father? What if Marcus Ellison decided to make an example of him? Derek was no stranger to pushing the limits of his authority. He'd been in the force for nearly a decade, long enough to learn that sometimes bending the rules got results. But now, for the first time, he wondered if he pushed too far. The rest of the shift passed in haze. The call to 14th and Pine turned out to be a false alarm, and Derek spent the rest of the night patrolling in silence, his mind replaying every detail of the encounter with Jordan. By the time his shift ended, the sun was beginning to rise, casting an orange glow over the city. Derek parked his squad car and sat there for a moment, staring at the steering wheel. He needed sleep, but his nerves were shot, and the thought of what might come next kept him wired. At home, he collapsed onto the couch without bothering to change out of his uniform. His phone buzzed on the coffee table, and he jumped, his heart racing. He grabbed it, half expecting to see Marcus Ellison's name on the screen. But it was just a text from his partner, Jake. ***, you good? Heard you had a run-in with someone last night. ***. Derek frowned. How had Jake heard about it already? He typed a quick reply. ***, what are you talking about? ***. A few minutes later, Jake responded. ***, word gets around. Be careful, man. Ellison's not someone to mess with. ***. Derek tossed the phone aside, frustration bubbling to the surface. It was bad enough that he couldn't get the incident out of his head. But now it seemed like the entire department was already talking about it. How? Did Jordan already tell her father? Or was this just one of those things that spread like wildfire through the cop grapevine? Either way, it didn't matter. The damage was done. The next day, Derek tried to go about his routine as usual, but the tension was impossible to ignore. At the station, he caught whispers from other officers, quick glances in his direction before people turned away. He didn't bother asking what they were talking about, he knew. Then, just before lunch, the captain called him into his office. Derek's stomach dropped as he walked down the hallway, each step feeling heavier than the last. Captain Ramirez was a no-nonsense kind of guy, a veteran with a stern demeanor that made even the most seasoned officers sit up straight. He gestured for Derek to close the door and motioned for him to sit. Derek, Ramirez began, his tone measured. You had an interaction last night with Jordan Ellison. Is that correct? Derek nodded, his mouth suddenly dry. Yes, sir. Do you know who her father is? Yes, sir, Derek repeated, his voice quieter this time. Ramirez leaned forward, folding his hands on the desk. I got a call this morning. Not from Marcus Ellison himself, but from someone close to him. Let's just say they weren't thrilled about how you handled things. Derek shifted uncomfortably in his seat. I didn't do anything wrong, Captain. I asked her some questions, that's all. Maybe, Ramirez said, his eyes narrowing. But perception matters, Derek. And when someone like Marcus Ellison gets involved, things can escalate quickly. I need you to think very carefully about how you proceed. This isn't the kind of situation that goes away on its own. Derek nodded again, though his mind was racing. What did proceed carefully even mean? Was he supposed to apologize? Lay low and hope it blew over? Ramirez didn't offer any further advice, just dismissed him with a pointed look that said, Asterisk, don't make this worse, asterisk. As the day dragged on, Derek's anxiety grew. He replayed Ramirez's words in his head, wondering if the call had been a warning or a promise of things to come. He thought about Jordan's face, the way she looked at him with quiet confidence, like she already knew how this would end. That evening, he decided to do something he rarely did, go for a run. He needed to clear his head, to get some kind of perspective on the situation. As he jogged through the park near his apartment, the rhythmic pounding of his feet on the pavement helped calm his nerves. But just as he was starting to feel a little more like himself, he spotted something, or rather someone, that made him stop in his tracks. Sitting on a bench near the fountain was Jordan Ellison. She wasn't wearing the hoodie this time, but there was no mistaking her. Her curly hair was pulled back into a loose bun, and she was scrolling through her phone, completely unaware of his presence. For a moment, Derek considered walking away, pretending he hadn't seen her. But something stopped him. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was the need to understand why this encounter was haunting him so much. He approached cautiously, his sneakers crunching on the gravel path. She looked up as he got closer, her expression shifting from surprise to something unreadable. Officer Lawson, she said, her tone neutral. Didn't expect to see you here. Neither did I, Derek admitted, stopping a few feet away. Mind if I sit? Jordan shrugged, her gaze drifting back to her phone. It's a free country. Derek sat down, unsure of how to start. After a long pause, he finally said, Look, about last night. You don't need to explain, she interrupted, her voice calm but firm. I know how this works. You see someone like me, and you assume I don't belong. Happens all the time. Her words stung more than Derek expected. That's not fair, he said defensively. I was just doing my job. Maybe, Jordan said, turning to face him. But your job didn't stop you from assuming the worst about me, did it? Derek opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. She wasn't wrong, and he knew it. Derek sat there, her words hanging between them like a weight. He didn't want to admit it, but she was right. In those first moments, when he'd seen her walking in the rain, he hadn't given her the benefit of the doubt. His instincts, the same ones he prided himself on as a cop, had betrayed him. He'd assumed she was up to no good because she looked like someone who didn't belong in that neighborhood, because she was young, because she was black, because, well, there was no because that didn't make him feel worse about himself. Jordan didn't wait for him to respond. She leaned back on the bench, crossing her arms, her phone now forgotten in her lap. You know, she said after a moment, her tone softer, but still laced with steel. It's not the first time this has happened to me. It probably won't be the last, but it's always interesting to see how people react when they figure out who my dad is. Suddenly, everything changes. Derek frowned, unsure how to respond. He wanted to say that it wasn't about her father, that it wasn't personal. But deep down, he knew that wasn't entirely true. Knowing Marcus Ellison's name had changed everything for him. It wasn't just the fear of professional fallout. It was the realization that Jordan wasn't just another face in the crowd. She had power, even if it wasn't her own. And that power had exposed something about Derek that he wasn't ready to confront. "I didn't know who you were," he said finally, his voice low. "When I stopped you, I mean." Jordan raised an eyebrow, a faint smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. "And would have made a difference if you did." Derek hesitated, and that pause was answer enough. She nodded, as if she'd expected nothing else. "That's what I thought." For a while, neither of them said anything. The sounds of the park filled the silence, the distant laughter of children, the chirping of birds, the hum of traffic in the background. Derek found himself watching her, trying to piece together what kind of person she was beyond the name, beyond the confidence. She didn't seem angry, not really. Frustrated, maybe. Tired, like someone who had been through this dance too many times before. Finally, he asked, "Why didn't you tell me last night?" "Who you were, I mean." Jordan shrugged. "Why should I have to?" "So you treat me like a person instead of a suspect." "That's not how it's supposed to work." Her words hit harder than he expected. Derek thought about all the training sessions on bias and de-escalation, all the lectures from higher-ups about treating everyone equally. He'd always assumed he was doing a good job at it. But now, sitting here with Jordan, he realized how blind he'd been to his own flaws. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, the words tasting foreign on his tongue. He wasn't used to apologizing, especially not like this. But it felt like the only thing he could say. Jordan studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she let out a small sigh, like she was letting go of something heavy. "Okay," she said simply, "but words don't mean much unless you back them up." Derek nodded, unsure of what else to say. He felt like he was teetering on the edge of something, like this conversation was more than just about last night. It was about him, about the choices he made every day, about the kind of person he wanted to be. Before he could figure out how to respond, Jordan stood up, brushing invisible dust off her jeans. "Well," she said, her tone lighter now, "I've got stuff to do. And you probably have, whatever it is cops do when they're not stopping random people in the street." Derek almost smiled at that the weight in his chest didn't lift. "Yeah," he said, "take care of yourself." Jordan nodded and walked away, her pace unhurried, like she had all the time in the world. Derek watched her go, wondering if he'd ever see her again, and what he'd do if he did. The rest of the week passed in a blur, but Derek couldn't shake the encounter. It wasn't just Jordan's words that lingered. It was the way she carried herself, the quiet strength that seemed so out of place for someone her age. He found himself looking her up online, not out of some official capacity, but because he needed to know more. Her social media accounts were private, but there were plenty of articles about her father. Photos of Marcus Ellison at charity galas, shaking hands with politicians, giving speeches about justice and equality. And in some of those photos, there she was, standing by his side, smiling like she didn't have a care in the world. But there was one article that stood out. It was buried deep in a local news archive, dated 3 years ago. Teen daughter of Marcus Ellison involved in alleged racial profiling incident. Derek clicked on it, his stomach tightening as he read. The story detailed how Jordan, then only 16, had been pulled over by a different officer in a different part of town. The officer had accused her of driving a stolen car, despite her presenting proof of ownership. Marcus Ellison had gotten involved, of course, and the story had made headlines for weeks. Derek leaned back in his chair, the words blurring in front of him. No wonder she'd been so quick to call him out. She'd been through this before, maybe more times than he realized. And here he was, just another cop who'd added to the list. That night, Derek couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about the look on her face when she'd asked if it would have made a difference if he'd known who she was. He wanted to believe that it wouldn't have, that he would have treated her the same regardless. But he wasn't sure. And that uncertainty gnawed at him, making him question everything he thought he knew about himself. The next morning, he decided to do something he rarely did. He went to church. Not because he was particularly religious, but because it was one of the few places he could sit and think without interruption. He sat in the back pew, staring at the stained glass windows, trying to make sense of the knot in his chest. As the choir began to sing, he found himself thinking not just about Jordan, but about the job, about the choices he made every day, the people he stopped, the assumptions he carried with him. He'd always thought of himself as one of the good guys, someone who was making a difference. But now, for the first time, he wondered if that was just an illusion he built to protect himself from the truth. When he left the church, the sun was shining, but the weight in his chest hadn't lifted. He didn't know what to do next, but one thing was clear. He couldn't go back to the way things were. Not after this. The following week brought no reprieve for Derek. If anything, the tension seemed to thicken, suffocating him at every turn. He could feel it at the station, where his colleagues gave him knowing looks but said nothing. It was in the uneasy silence of his apartment when he lay awake at night, replaying the same thoughts over and over. And it was in the eyes of every person he stopped on his shifts, each interaction now tinged with a self-awareness he couldn't shake. He started questioning himself, second-guessing every move, every word. Was he being fair? Was he assuming too much? One afternoon, as he was patrolling a neighborhood on the outskirts of town, his radio crackled to life. All units disturbance reported at the Ellison residence. Proceed with caution. The voice of the dispatcher was calm, almost detached, but the name hit Derek like a lightning bolt. He gripped the steering wheel tightly, his heart pounding in his chest. The Ellison residence. Derek's first thought was to ignore the call. Surely other officers were closer. Surely someone else would handle it. But he knew he couldn't. If he stayed away, it would only make him look worse, like he was avoiding the situation. And if he was honest with himself, he wanted to go. He needed to go. Maybe this was his chance to fix things. Or maybe it would only make everything worse. He wasn't sure anymore. By the time he arrived, the scene was already chaotic. 2 squad cars were parked in the long driveway of the sprawling Ellison estate, their lights flashing against the sleek black gates. A small crowd of neighbors had gathered on the sidewalk, whispering to each other as they craned their necks for a better view. Derek parked his car and stepped out, his stomach twisting in knots. As he approached the house, he could hear raised voices coming from inside. The front door was wide open, and 2 officers stood on the porch, looking uneasy. Derek recognized one of them, Officer Hernandez, a rookie who'd only been on the force for a few months. She glanced at him, her expression a mixture of relief and uncertainty. "What's going on?" Derek asked, keeping his voice low. Hernandez hesitated, then gestured toward the house. There was a 911 call. Domestic disturbance. Neighbors reported shouting, said they heard glass breaking. But what? She glanced back at the open door, lowering her voice even more. "It's Marcus Ellison, and he's not happy we're here." Derek's chest tightened. Of course he wasn't. A man like Marcus Ellison didn't like the police showing up at his doorstep, especially not for something like this. Derek could already imagine how this would go. Ellison would demand answers, assert his authority, and make it clear that no one had the right to question him or his family. Still, Derek couldn't ignore the call. He took a deep breath and stepped inside, his boots echoing on the polished marble floor. The house was as grand as he'd expected. High ceilings, expensive artwork on the walls, furniture that looked like it belonged in a museum. But the air was thick with tension. In the center of the living room stood Marcus Ellison himself, his tall, imposing figure commanding the space. He was dressed in a crisp suit, as if he'd just come from a meeting, but his expression was anything but polished. His jaw was tight, his eyes blazing with barely contained anger. Jordan stood a few feet away, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She looked smaller than Derek remembered, her usual confidence replaced by something more fragile. Her eyes flicked to him briefly before darting away. "You've got some nerve," Marcus said, his voice low and sharp. He wasn't addressing Derek specifically, but the room seemed to vibrate with the force of his words. "Coming into my home, disrupting my family based on nothing but hearsay. Sir, Derek began, keeping his tone as measured as possible. We responded to a call. We're just here to make sure everything's okay. Everything's fine, Marcus snapped, his eyes narrowing. As you can see, there's no emergency here. Now, I suggest you leave before you make things worse. Derek hesitated, glancing at Jordan. She hadn't said a word, but the tension in her posture was impossible to ignore. Something was wrong. He could feel it, even if he couldn't put his finger on what it was. Miss Ellison, he said carefully, addressing her directly. Is everything all right? Jordan looked at him then, her eyes unreadable. For a moment, it seemed like she might say something, but Marcus cut in before she could. She's fine, he said firmly. A private family matter doesn't concern you. Derek's instincts kicked in. He'd seen this dynamic before, powerful men trying to control the narrative, shutting down anyone who dared to question them. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than Marcus was letting on. With all due respect, sir, Derek said, forcing himself to meet Marcus's glare. We need to hear that from her. The room fell silent. Marcus' expression darkened, and for a moment, Derek thought he might explode. But then, to everyone's surprise, Jordan spoke. It's fine, she said quietly. Her voice was steady, but there was an edge to it that made Derek's stomach turn. He's right. It's just a misunderstanding. Derek wanted to believe her, but something about the way she said it didn't sit right. He glanced at the broken glass on the floor, a shattered vase, by the looks of it, and then back at Jordan. Her hands were clenched into fists at her sides, her shoulders tense. Are you sure? He asked, keeping his voice gentle. If there's anything you need to say. I said it's fine, Jordan interrupted, her voice sharper now. She looked at him with a mixture of frustration and something else he couldn't quite place. Fear, resignation. Derek felt his jaw tighten, but he nodded. He couldn't push her, not without more to go on. But he also couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. As he turned to leave, Marcus stepped closer, his voice low enough that only Derek could hear. Let me make something clear, Marcus said, his tone dripping with menace. You don't belong here. If you value your career, you'll remember that. Derek didn't respond. He just walked out, the tension in his chest heavier than ever. As he stepped back into the cool evening air, he glanced over at his shoulder, catching one last glimpse of Jordan through the window. She was standing perfectly still, her arms wrapped around herself, staring at the floor. Something was wrong. Derek could feel it in his gut, but what could he do? As Derek walked away from the Ellison estate, the weight of Marcus's warning sat heavy on his shoulders. The man's words played over in his mind, but it wasn't just the threat that bothered him. It was Jordan. Her face, her body language, it all screamed that she wasn't okay. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was something she wasn't saying. And then there was the broken vase. That wasn't nothing. Broken glass didn't happen in a misunderstanding. Back at the station, Derek tried to push it from his mind, but it kept creeping back. He considered bringing it up to his supervisor, but what could he say? That he had a bad feeling. That Marcus Ellison, one of the most respected men in the city, had told him to back off. It would sound paranoid at best, insubordinate at worst. Besides, Derek had no proof, only a gut instinct that had been wrong before. The next evening, as he was wrapping up his shift, his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and saw an unknown number. He hesitated before answering, but something compelled him to pick up. Officer Derek? The voice on the other end was quiet, almost hesitant. Yes. Who is this? There was a pause, and then, it's Jordan. Derek sat up straighter, his heart suddenly pounding. He hadn't expected to hear from her again. Jordan, are you okay? Her voice wavered, and for the first time, he heard a crack in the armor she'd worn so well. I didn't know who else to call. I think someone's watching me. What do you mean? Derek asked, his voice low but urgent. Jordan took a shaky breath. Since last night, I've noticed things. A car parked outside the house that doesn't belong. A man standing across the street this morning, just staring. And when I left for class earlier, I felt like someone was following me. I thought it was just my imagination, but now, I don't know. Derek's mind raced. Did you tell your father? There was a long pause before she replied. No, I can't. He'd just tell me I'm being paranoid, or worse, he'd use it as an excuse to tighten control. I don't want to give him more power over my life. Derek's grip on the phone tightened. The situation was more complicated than he realized. All right, listen. I'm off duty, but I can come by and check things out. Can you give me your location? Jordan hesitated again, then finally said, I'm at a cafe downtown. The Green Bean. I didn't want to go home yet. I'm on my way. Stay where you are, and don't go outside unless you have to. By the time Derek arrived at the cafe, the sun had set, and the streets were bathed in the warm glow of streetlights. He spotted Jordan sitting at a small table near the window, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. She looked up as he walked in, her eyes darting nervously to the door. Did you see anyone on your way here? She asked as he sat down across from her. Derek shook his head. No one suspicious, but that doesn't mean they're not around. Can you tell me more about what you've noticed? Jordan fidgeted with the edge of her sleeve, her usual confidence nowhere to be found. It started last night, after you left. I was in my room when I noticed headlights outside my window. They were there for at least an hour before they drove off. And then this morning that man, I swear, he was watching the house. He left when I came out, but I saw him again near campus later. I don't know why this is happening. Derek frowned. Do you think it has anything to do with your father? Jordan's expression darkened. It always does. He has enemies, people who hate him for what he stands for, or for the deals he's made. But he pretends like none of it touches us, like we're untouchable. She shook her head. I've never felt untouchable. Before Derek could respond, Jordan's phone buzzed on the table. She picked it up, her brow furrowing as she read the screen. Unknown number, she muttered, showing it to Derek. Answer it, he said, but put it on speaker. Jordan hesitated but did as he said. Hello, she said cautiously. There was a moment of silence, and then a deep, distorted voice came through the line. You should have stayed quiet, Jordan. Derek's blood ran cold as he watched her face go pale. Who is this? She demanded, her voice trembling but defiant. The voice didn't answer her question. Instead, it said, This isn't over. The line went dead. Jordan stared at the phone, her hands shaking. Derek leaned closer, his mind racing. Do you recognize the voice? Could it be someone your father knows? She shook her head. I don't know. It didn't sound familiar, but with the distortion, it could be anyone. Derek glanced around the cafe, his senses on high alert. We need to get you somewhere safe. If this is connected to your father, it might be more serious than we thought. Jordan hesitated. Safe? Where's safe when you're part of the Ellison family? Derek didn't have an answer for that. All he knew was that the situation was spiraling, and they were running out of time.